When Gideon Hale, the toughest man in the frontier, walked into the church with Maris Rowan, the town erupted in laughter. They called her a burden. They said he was crazy. A large woman nobody would even look at. How could she possibly survive in this harsh land? But while they laughed, Maris watched. While they scorned, she planned. And when the valley crumbled, those very people who had mocked her were now kneeling and begging for her help. Like to support the channel, comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has come, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The laughter started before the ceremony was even finished. It rippled through the crowd the way a stone skips across still water. Light at first, almost polite. The kind of sound people make when they're not sure if they're allowed to react yet. Then someone in the back pew let out a full snort, and that broke whatever thin courtesy had been holding the room together. By the time Reverend Aldous spoke the closing words, half the congregation was exchanging glances that said everything their mouths hadn't yet. Gideon Hale, of all people. Gideon Hale, who ran the second largest cattle operation in Calhoun County, who had turned down the Beaumont girl and the Price widow both, who every mother in the Sweetwater Valley had pointed to as a catch worth catching, Gideon Hale had married Maris Rowan. The pews creaked as people leaned together. Whispers curled through the small church like smoke from a damp fire. She must have something on him. Or he lost a bet. Lord, look at her. How's she going to survive a winter out at the Hale place? That ranch will eat her alive. Maris heard it. She had excellent hearing, always had, which was both a gift and a particular kind of curse in a town this size. She kept her face arranged into something neutral as she walked back down the aisle on Gideon's arm, her hand resting in the crook of his elbow, her eyes fixed on the rectangle of pale light that was the open church door ahead of them. She did not look left. She did not look right. Outside, the August sun hit them like a fist. Gideon didn't say anything about the laughter. He helped her up into the wagon with the same steady, practical care he brought to every task he undertook, checked that she was settled, and climbed up beside her. He clicked his tongues at the two bays, and they rolled out of Harlan, past the feed store and the assay office, and the long flat front of Clancy's saloon, where three men stood on the porch watching them go. One of them raised his beer glass in what might have been a toast, or might have been something else entirely. "Don't," Maris said, when she saw Gideon's jaw tighten. "I wasn't going to do anything." "You were thinking about doing something." He exhaled through his nose. "Maybe." The road out of Harlan ran west along the creek bottom for 2 miles before it climbed into the dry bench country where the Hale Ranch spread across 3,000 acres of short grass and red clay. It was not beautiful land, not in any way that would make a painter reach for his brushes. It was useful land, or it had been, in years when the rains came when they were supposed to. Maris had ridden out this direction twice before, once when she'd come to discuss terms with Gideon, and once when she'd come back to finalize them. Both times she had paid close attention to the soil, to the way the grass grew and where it thinned out, to the angle of the hills and how the wind moved across them. She had a habit of paying close attention to things. People tended to overlook that about her, which she had always found convenient. Maris Rowan had come to Sweetwater Valley from outside Abilene, arriving by stage 18 months ago with 2 trunks, a leather-bound ledger that she'd filled to the margins with her own notes, and exactly nobody expecting her. She had a mother-sister in Harlan who had written twice asking her to come, and when Maris's situation in Abilene had finally resolved itself, messily, expensively, but resolved, she had packed her trunks and gone. She was 31 years old. She was not small. She had never been small, not as a child, not as a grown woman, and she had long since come to a kind of private armistice with that fact, the terms of which involved not wasting energy on what couldn't be changed when there was always something useful she could be doing instead. Her face was broad and open, with dark eyes that had a way of settling on a person with more weight than most people were comfortable with. Her hair, when it was down, was thick and dark, and reached her shoulder blades. For work, she kept it pinned back so tightly that she sometimes got headaches by mid-afternoon. In Abilene, she had worked the books for a livestock broker named Cutter Reese. She had done this for 6 years and had become, without anyone quite intending it, The reason Reese's operation didn't collapse every other season. She knew cattle prices and drought patterns, and the way desperate ranchers made decisions when they were backed into corners. She knew how water rights worked and how they could be manipulated, and she knew which directions markets moved when the big outfits in Kansas City started tightening their credit. She knew all of this not because anyone had taught her, but because she had read everything she could get her hands on and had kept careful notes and had paid attention, always, to the gap between what people said and what the numbers actually showed. When Reese sold his operation and retired to Denver, Maris was out of a job. She was also, at 31, considered by most of the men in Abilene to be a complicated proposition at best. There had been a man once, she did not think about him often anymore, or tried not to, who had told her that she thought too much for her own good. He had meant it as a criticism. She had eventually come to understand it as information. Her aunt in Harlan was called Nessa Folk, a thin, cheerful woman who ran the town's only bakery and had the useful quality of not asking unnecessary questions. Maris settled into the room above the bakery, started doing the accounts for 3 businesses in town, and spent her evenings reading the county land records at the courthouse and her afternoons watching the way the valley's cattle economy moved or failed to move. She had been in Harlan 4 months when she first spoke to Gideon Hale. He had come into town to argue with the bank. This was not unusual. Half the ranchers in Sweetwater Valley were arguing with the bank about something that year because the previous summer had been thin and the one before that had been worse. But Gideon argued differently than most. He didn't bluster. He didn't threaten. He came in with a folder of papers and went through them point by point in a flat, careful voice that suggested he had gone over them alone many times before coming here. Maris happened to be sitting in the outer office of Harlan's one attorney, waiting on some paperwork, when she heard the argument through the partition. She had not intended to listen. She listened anyway, because she could not help it, because what she was hearing was a man who understood his own situation, but was missing something critical about how to address it. She caught him coming out of the bank. "Your water rights documentation has a gap," she said, without preamble. He stopped. He was tall. She had noticed that from across the street once or twice, with weathered skin and reddish-brown hair going gray at the temples, and gray eyes that had the look of someone who spent most of his time measuring distances. He looked at her for a moment in a way that wasn't unfriendly, but was thoroughly assessing. "Beg your pardon?" "Your water rights on the North Fork of your property. There's a gap in the documentation between 1871 and 1874. If you're trying to use them as security for a loan, the bank's attorney is going to find that gap and use it against you. They may have already found it." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she almost walked away. "How do you know what my water rights documentation looks like?" he finally said. "The county records are public. You read county land records." "When I have time." He looked at her for another moment. "Gideon Hale," he said, and put out his hand. "Maris Rowan." They shook. His hand was calloused in specific places. She noted which ones, out of habit. "That gap you mentioned," he said. "Is it fixable?" "Probably. You'd need to file a quiet title action and produce some secondary evidence to establish continuous use. It'll take a few months and cost you some attorney's fees, but it should hold up. Can you write that down for me?" She wrote it down. He read it carefully, folded the paper, and put it in his breast pocket. Then he looked at her with those measuring gray eyes and said, "What do you want for this?" "Nothing. I was listening anyway." He didn't look like he believed her, which was fair. She wasn't entirely sure she believed herself. But she walked away, and she went back to her aunt's bakery, and she thought about the Hale Ranch and its water rights gap, and its 3,000 acres of short grass for the rest of the evening. He came back 2 weeks later. Not to the bank, to the bakery. He sat down at the small table near the window that Nessa kept for customers and ordered coffee. And when Maris came through from the back with a basket of bread, he said, "The attorney thinks the quiet title action will work. He said he'd seen that approach before, but didn't think to apply it here." "It's a straightforward application," Maris said. "He also said I'd have been in serious trouble if the bank had moved first." "You would have." Gideon wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I want to ask you something. And I want you to know that I'm asking it seriously, not as a joke or an insult or anything of that kind." Maris set down the breadbasket. All right. Would you come out to the ranch and look at the books? She raised an eyebrow. What kind of shape are the books in? Bad. Bad in a fixable way or bad in a finished way? He thought about this with the same careful deliberateness he seemed to bring to everything. I think fixable, but I've been thinking that for 2 years and the shape keeps getting worse, so I may not be the right judge. She came out the following Thursday and spent 8 hours with his ledgers at the kitchen table. By the end of it, she had 6 pages of notes and a preliminary assessment that Gideon sat down and read in full while she drank 3 cups of coffee and watched him read. He was a slow reader, but he was a thorough one. He went back to certain pages more than once. This section here, he said, pointing, where you say the grazing rotation is wrong. It's depleting the southwest quarter faster than it can recover. In 2 more seasons, that section won't support 1/3 of the cattle it does now. I grew up running that rotation. I know. Your father did too, based on the old records. But the rainfall has shifted over the last 15 years. The grass species have changed. The rotation that worked in 1860 doesn't fit the land you're actually running cattle on now. He looked at her. How much of this are you certain about? The grazing analysis I'm certain about. Some of the projections depend on what the rains do, which nobody's certain about. Fair enough. He closed the ledger. I'd like you to come back. She came back. She came back the following week and the week after, and at some point the arrangement shifted from consultation to something more regular and harder to name. She started keeping a separate set of notes specifically about the hail operation. She found herself in the evenings working through problems related to his range management and his water usage, and the particular inefficiencies in how he bought and sold his cattle, not because she was being paid for it, but because the problems were genuinely interesting to her. She wasn't sure when it crossed a line into something else. Probably sometime in the winter, when there was a week of hard freeze and a section of his water line broke, and she drove out in the cold because she'd been thinking about how to prevent exactly that kind of failure and had a solution she needed to show him. They'd spent 4 hours in the cold fixing it together, and afterwards stood in his kitchen with their hands wrapped around hot coffee cups, and he'd said, out of nowhere, "You must be bored here. With what you know, you could be doing this for an outfit 10 times this size somewhere." She'd thought about it. Maybe. Why aren't you? She didn't have a clean answer for that. She gave him the complicated one instead. That she didn't entirely trust large operations, that she'd seen how they worked from the inside and how the people who ran them used up the smart ones who worked for them without much conscience about it, and that she preferred to understand a smaller thing thoroughly than to be one cog in a larger machine she'd never see the whole of. He'd nodded slowly at that, like it was information he was filing away. The proposal came in early spring, delivered with the same flat directness he used for everything else, sitting across the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He said he'd been thinking about it since October, that he wasn't a man who was good at ornamental conversation and would rather say the thing plainly, that he believed they suited each other, that he respected her mind and her judgment more than he'd respected those qualities in anyone else he'd met, and that if she were willing to consider it, he thought they could build something together that was worth building. She asked for 2 weeks to think about it. She used the 2 weeks to finalize her own analysis of what a partnership with the Hale Ranch actually looked like, its risks, its possible returns, its vulnerabilities. She was aware that this was an unusual way to approach the question. She decided she didn't care. At the end of 2 weeks, she said yes. The wedding itself was a small, practical affair, or it was supposed to be. Nessa insisted on a church ceremony, and because Maris was fond of her aunt, she agreed. The size of the congregation surprised her. She had not expected so many people to turn up to watch, but Harlan was a small town and Gideon Hale was somebody people had opinions about, and apparently his choice of bride was more remarkable to them than she'd anticipated. She'd stood at the front of the church in a dark blue dress that Nessa had helped her make, listening to the reverend and feeling the weight of the room behind her. Not hostile exactly, more like a crowd watching a thing fall to see how bad the crash would be. She had been through worse. She fixed her attention forward. The reception was held in the church hall. The food was Nessa's, and it was excellent, and a handful of people, the ones who were kind enough or indifferent enough to fashion, came up and wished them well. Most of the room kept a careful social distance, the way people stand back from something they're not sure about. One man came up, a heavy-set rancher named Doyle Maddock, who ran the largest operation in the county and who had, Maris knew, considered himself something of an authority on how things should be done in Sweetwater Valley. He shook Gideon's hand and gave Maris a long look that had no warmth in it whatsoever. "Quite a match," he said. "Thank you," Gideon said, his voice flat. "I hope she works out better than your last grazing plan." He smiled and walked away. Gideon started to say something. Maris put her hand on his arm. "He'll be asking me for help inside of 2 years," she said quietly. Gideon looked at her. "That confident?" "I've read his water reports. He has the same problem you had, plus 3 others he doesn't know about yet. When they surface, he'll come around." A pause. Then, very quietly, Gideon said, "Remind me not to argue with you." "You'll forget and do it anyway." "Probably." She almost smiled. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get her through the rest of the afternoon. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected. Not grand, but solidly built, with a kitchen that faced east to catch the morning light and a back room that Gideon had been using for storage but which could clearly be made into a proper office. She stood in the middle of it on her first evening and looked at the shelves full of old harness and broken equipment and stacked paper, and she was already thinking about what to take out and what to put in. "I know it's a mess," Gideon said from the doorway. "Everything's a mess at the start." She turned around. "I'll need a proper desk in here, and I want to redo the filing system for the land records." "All right." "I also want to ride the full property line in the next 2 weeks. All of it, not just the sections you showed me. It's a lot of ground to cover." "I know, I want to see it myself." He nodded. "I'll take you." "You don't have to come." "I know I don't have to." He pushed himself off the doorframe. "I want to." She looked at him for a moment. In the dim light of the back room, with the evening coming in through the small window, he looked tired in the way that men who have been carrying weight too long look tired. Not broken, but worn thin in specific places. She recognized it because she had a version of the same tiredness herself. "All right," she said. "We start at the north line. First light." "First light," he agreed, and went to start on supper. She spent the first month at the Hale Ranch in a state that she would later describe to herself as productive unease. Not unhappy. She had been unhappy before, and this wasn't that. But aware at every moment that she was building something on uncertain ground, and that the ground might shift in any direction. The cowboys who worked for Gideon were polite to her, which was its own kind of statement. Polite the way people are when they've been told to behave themselves, when the impulse underneath is something else. There were 6 of them. Decker, who was the foreman and who had been with Gideon since before the water rights trouble. Rafe, who was young and not good at hiding his expressions. Cantu, who was older and watched everything carefully and said almost nothing. 2 brothers named Fitch and Orrin Pruitt, who finished each other's sentences, and a man called Shepherd, whose first name Maris never learned, which seemed to be the way he preferred it. She did not try to establish authority directly. That was a losing approach, and she knew it. Instead, she started with the books, which she was clearly there to handle, and she asked careful questions when she needed information, and she paid attention to who knew what they were doing and who was performing for an audience. Rafe was performing. He worked harder than anybody when he thought she was watching, which meant he was working to show her she wasn't needed, which meant he was insecure about something. She filed that away. Cantu was the one who actually knew the land. He'd been in the valley 15 years, longer than most, and he rode the range the way a person walks through a room they've lived in for decades, without looking at his feet. She started riding with him when she could, asking questions that were partly practical and partly designed to understand what he understood. He answered them in short sentences that assumed she could extrapolate, which she could, and after about 2 weeks he stopped giving her sidelong looks and started directing information at her directly. "The east well's going to need new casing before winter," he told her one afternoon, without preamble, while they were checking the fence along the back quarter. "How much time do we have?" "Maybe 6 weeks before the cold sets in hard." "Cost?" "I'll work up a number." "Do that, and find out if anyone else in the area is doing well work. If we can coordinate, we can bring the materials cost down." He looked at her sideways. I know a man out at the Greer place who's been meaning to pull and reline their well for 2 seasons. Talk to him. He pulled on his gloves, already thinking about it. That was when she decided Cantu was going to be useful. The first confrontation came at the end of her 3rd week, and it came from a direction she hadn't expected. She was in the back office, her office now, the storage cleaned out, a proper desk installed, the land records filed in a system that made sense, working through a set of purchase records from the previous year when she heard someone come in through the kitchen and go directly to Gideon's chair in the front room, which was where he sat in the evenings. She heard the chair settle and recognized, after a moment, the voice as belonging to Doyle Maddock. She stayed at her desk. The conversation was too low to follow at first, just the murmur of it. 2 men talking in the particular rhythm of men who have known each other a long time. Then Maddock's voice rose slightly, the way voices do when a point is being pressed. Her running your numbers, Gideon, that's one thing, but the decisions have to come from you. Men aren't going to take orders from... She's not giving orders, Gideon said. His voice was level. Not yet. Doyle, I'm telling you what I'm seeing from outside. People talk. The way she rode out to the Greer line last week asking questions, that's going to... She rode out to talk to the Greers about coordinating well work, which is going to save us both money. Both of us, Doyle. I've already told them you might be interested. A pause. That's not the point, Maddox said. What is the point? The point is that a man should... He stopped, started again. People are watching, Gideon. What you do here sets an example for how things run in this valley. You understand that. I understand that you've been running this valley your way for a long time, Gideon said. And I understand that my operation was in serious trouble before Maris started working on it. So I'm going to keep listening to her. If that bothers people, they can come tell me themselves. Another pause. Longer this time. You know I'm trying to help. I know. Gideon's voice shifted into something that sounded almost like tiredness, or maybe patience, which could look similar. I appreciate it, but this is how we're doing things. She heard the creak of the chair as Maddox stood. She heard the front door open and close. She sat for a moment at her desk, looking at the purchase records without reading them. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. The water issue surfaced in October. She had been tracking the spring on the northeast corner of the Hale property, tracking it the way she tracked everything, with notes and measurements, recording the flow rate every 2 weeks because something in the spring's location, relative to the drainage pattern of the hills above it, had told her to pay attention. In October, the flow dropped by 1/3. She rode up to the spring with Cantu on a cold, clear morning, and they spent 2 hours looking at the land above it. The signs weren't dramatic. A new wagon track cutting across the upper meadow, not far from the Beasley property line. Ground disturbance in a specific pattern around the head of the drainage. The grass cropped differently than it should have been for the time of year, which meant livestock had been moved through there recently and more heavily than the grazing pattern would suggest. Somebody's been diverting, Cantu said. He wasn't asking. Looks like it. Maris crouched and pressed her fingers into the disturbed ground. Recent. The Beasley boys. Maybe, or someone using the Beasley land. She stood up. I need to pull the water rights records for this drainage and the 3 adjacent ones. What are you going to do? She looked at the upper meadow for a moment, at the wagon track and the torn-up ground. I'm going to figure out exactly what was diverted and exactly who has the right to it and exactly what remedy we're entitled to. Then I'm going to decide what to do. You want me to... I want you to ride the property line east and tell me if you see anything else that looks wrong. Don't confront anyone. Just look. He nodded and turned his horse. She stayed at the spring for a while longer, making notes. The morning was cold enough that her breath misted, and the hills above her were the particular dull gold of October grass, and she could see for miles in every direction across the valley, all the small ranches scattered across it, all the water that fed them, all the lines on maps that said who owned what. She thought about the water. She thought about who needed it, and who had the right to it, and how those two things were sometimes the same and sometimes very different. She thought about the way the ranches in the valley were positioned relative to each other, and what would happen when the drought years came. And they were coming. She was nearly certain of that. She'd been following the rainfall records for this part of the territory for 18 months, and the trend was not reassuring. She made one more note, closed the ledger, and turned her horse back toward the ranch. She was at the kitchen table with the water rights document spread across it when Gideon came in that evening, pulling off his gloves and smelling of cold air and horse. He looked at the papers and then at her. Something wrong? Possibly. Someone's been diverting from the northeast spring. He stood very still for a moment. How much? About a third of the flow, maybe more. I've only been tracking it for 2 months, so I may not be seeing the full picture. The Beasleys? Unknown. I'm going through the water rights documents now. Sit down and look at this with me. He sat. They went through the documents together, which meant she explained them, and he followed and asked questions when he didn't follow, and she answered the questions directly because he was paying attention, and there was no reason to be anything but direct. By 9 o'clock, they had a reasonably clear picture of what the rights were and where the legal line was and how it had been crossed. I could ride over to Beasley's tomorrow, Gideon said. Not yet. Maris, if you ride over tomorrow without the full documentation in hand, it becomes a neighborly dispute. He'll apologize, maybe fix the diversion, and nothing changes. I want to build the full case first. If this is what it looks like, it's not just us. It's anybody else who draws from the same drainage. That's the Greers and probably the Hollis place on the south side. You want to involve them? I want to have all the information before anyone rides anywhere. 2 weeks. He looked at her. 2 weeks. Maybe less if the records cooperate. He turned back to the documents. All right. He picked up one of the pages. Walk me through this one again. She walked him through it. Outside, the October wind moved through the valley, pushing clouds across a hard, bright sky, carrying the first real cold of the season down from the northern hills. She didn't think about Doyle Maddox's voice through the wall. She didn't think about the wedding and the laughter that had moved through the church pews like water through cracked ground. She thought about the documents in front of her and the water that ran through the spring on the northeast corner and the land that needed to be understood before it could be properly defended. That was what she was good at. That was what she had always been good at. She was starting to understand that this valley was going to need it. The water records took 11 days, not 2 weeks. Maris worked through them at the kitchen table after supper each evening, with Gideon sometimes sitting across from her reading his own paperwork and sometimes absent, out checking stock or talking to Decker about the next day's work. The lamp burned low by 10 o'clock, and she would refill it and keep going, because the picture forming in the documents was worse than she'd initially thought, and she wanted to be certain she understood it completely before she said anything to anyone. The diversion from the northeast spring was not the Beasley boys acting on their own. What she found, working backward through 3 years of filed water claims and 2 sets of county survey maps that didn't quite match each other, was a systematic pattern. Small adjustments, filed quietly, each one individually defensible, collectively amounting to a slow redrawing of who controlled water in the upper drainage. Someone had been doing this carefully. Someone who understood that no single change would be large enough to trigger a challenge, but that enough small changes would add up to something decisive before anyone noticed. She sat back in her chair on the 11th night and looked at what she had. "Gideon," she said. He was across the room mending a piece of harness. He looked up. "Come look at this." He came around the table and stood behind her, looking at the documents laid out in the order she'd arranged them. She walked him through it without editorializing, just the sequence and what each piece showed. He was quiet the whole time. When she finished, he straightened up and stood there for a moment with his arms crossed. "Who filed all of these?" he asked. "Officially, they're filed under 4 different names. 3 of them are small operators who sold out and left the area in the last 2 years. The 4th is a man named Calder Voss." Voss. Gideon's voice went flat in a particular way. "He's out of Cheyenne. Land speculator." "You know him?" "I know of him. He came through here about 3 years back talking to the bigger outfits about consolidation. Maddox told him to leave." Maris looked at the documents. "It appears he didn't." A long silence. The lamp guttered slightly in a draft from the window. "What does he actually control now?" Gideon said. "If these filings are legitimate, and most of them are, technically, he controls the primary headwater access for about 40% of the upper drainage. which means in a dry year he controls who stays solvent and who doesn't. Gideon put his hands on the back of the chair. This is big enough that we can't handle it ourselves. No, we can't. She gathered the documents into a careful stack. We need to bring in the Greers and the Hollis family and probably the Campbells on the east side. And we need an attorney who's handled water rights litigation before, not just the local man. That's expensive. It is, but the alternative is more expensive. He was quiet again, thinking it through. That was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He didn't react to bad information with noise. He sat with it. I'll ride to the Greers tomorrow, he said finally. Will you come? Yes, but let me talk to Cantu first. He knows the Greer foreman, and that'll smooth the introduction. All right. He picked up the harness again. Get some sleep, Maris. In a minute. She stayed at the table another hour, making clean copies of her notes. The Greers received them with the careful courtesy of people who suspected they were about to hear something they didn't want to hear. Tom Greer was a compact, sun-darkened man in his mid-50s who had been running cattle in the valley since before either of the townships on either side of him had names. His wife, Agnes, poured coffee and sat down at the table herself, which Maris noted and appreciated. The Greer foreman, a weathered man named Purcell, whom Cantu had ridden with years ago, stood in the doorway. Maris spread the documents on the Greers' kitchen table and explained what she'd found. She was direct and thorough, and she did not soften the numbers. Halfway through, Agnes Greer leaned forward and started asking questions that were sharper than anything her husband had offered, which told Maris something useful about how decisions were actually made in that household. How certain are you, Agnes said. About the filings. Certain about what they show. Less certain about what Voss intends to do with them. He may be holding them as leverage, or he may be planning to act on them directly. Either way, the position is untenable. What do you need from us? Your water records for the past 5 years, whatever you have on file, and your agreement to join a collective challenge, which will require sharing the cost of outside legal representation. Tom Greer looked at his wife. She gave him a small nod that had the quality of a decision already made. What about Maddock? Tom said. I haven't spoken to him yet, Maris said. His holdings draw from a different part of the drainage, but if this expands, and I think it will, he'll be affected too. Doyle won't like being the last to know. No, Maris agreed. He won't. The meeting at the Hollis place went harder. Ray Hollis was a proud, close-mouthed man who had built his operation alone after his wife died. And he'd developed the habit of handling his problems privately that some men develop when they've had to carry everything themselves. He listened to Maris's presentation with his arms crossed and his face set in an expression that communicated, without words, that he was not inclined to let a woman he'd never met show him documents about his own water rights. I know my rights, he said when she finished. I don't doubt that, Maris said, but knowing them doesn't help if someone files a superior claim that goes unchallenged long enough to establish precedent. That's what you say. That's what the county records show. He looked at Gideon. You trust her read on this? Gideon met his look steadily. I do. Hollis was quiet for a while. Out in his yard, a dog barked once and went silent. How much is this legal action going to cost? He said. We're still getting estimates. Gideon and I will absorb a proportional share. Nobody's being asked to carry more than their operation can handle. You sure about that? No, Maris said. I'm not sure about anything yet, but I'm sure about what happens if we do nothing, and that outcome is worse. He agreed eventually, not warmly, but he agreed. As they rode out, Gideon said, That went better than I expected. Did it? He usually just says no and closes the door. He didn't want to be the one who let the water go. Gideon looked at her. How did you know that was the thing? Because it's the thing for all of them. The water isn't abstract to these people. It's the difference between keeping the land their families built and losing it. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. You appeal to the right thing, most people come around. The winter came in hard in December, harder than the previous two, and it changed the nature of the problem before Maris had finished building her case. In January, 3 ranches on the north side of the valley lost cattle to a combination of cold and inadequate feed reserves. Ranches that had counted on their usual supply arrangements, which had broken down when two of the main feed suppliers out of Cheyenne tightened credit without warning. By February, a fourth ranch was in serious trouble, and rumors were circulating that the bank in Harlan was considering calling in loans. Maris went to town and spent a day at the bank, not asking for anything, just looking at the situation clearly. She spoke to the bank manager, Elias Combs, who was a careful man and not unkind, but who was operating under pressure from the parent institution in Denver and did not have much room to maneuver. She listened to him explain his constraints and asked a series of questions that were partly diagnostic and partly designed to let him understand what she was thinking. "If those loans get called in," she said, "those properties go to sale. In this market, in this season, they'll sell at a loss. The bank recovers less than the loan value, and the valley loses productive operations that will take years to replace." Combs folded his hands on his desk. "I understand the math, Mrs. Hale. Then what I'm suggesting is that a structured deferral arrangement, temporary, with clear terms, serves the bank's actual interests better than a forced sale. The decision isn't entirely mine. I know, but the recommendation is yours." She set a single page of calculations on his desk. "Those are the projected recovery values under a forced sale scenario versus a 12-month deferral with partial interest payments continuing. The difference is not small." He looked at the page for a long time. She waited. "I'll take it to Denver," he said. "Thank you." She walked out into the February cold and stood for a moment on the plank sidewalk outside the bank, breathing air that felt like it could crack. She was not confident the bank would agree. She was not even sure she'd calculated everything correctly. She'd worked quickly, and there were assumptions in the model that might not hold. But she'd put something in front of Combs that gave him a reason to try, and sometimes that was all you could do. The bank agreed to the deferral on 3 of the 4 loans. The 4th was too far gone, and that ranch, the Wicker Place, a small operation on the valley's north edge, went to sale in March. Maris went to the auction with a number she had calculated precisely, a number that represented the minimum viable price for the land to be held by someone who would actually run cattle on it rather than warehouse it for speculation. She bid up to that number and stopped. The land went to a buyer from out of county for $800 more than her limit, and she went home and sat at her desk and looked at the wall for a while. Gideon came in and found her there. He didn't say anything immediately. He put a cup of coffee on the desk and leaned against the doorframe. "We couldn't have gone higher," she said, "not without hurting ourselves badly." "I know." "The Wicker family would have—" She stopped. "It doesn't help to go through it." "No." She picked up the coffee. It was too hot, and she held it anyway. "I keep thinking if I'd moved faster on the deferral proposal, if I'd gone to Combs in December instead of January. Maris." "I know." She set the cup down. "It doesn't help." "No," he said again, more quietly. "It doesn't." The grazing routes were the next problem, and this one she'd seen coming. The drought she'd been tracking in the rainfall records materialized that spring in a form that was less dramatic than a single bad season, and therefore worse. A slow, grinding deficit, insufficient rain month after month, never catastrophic enough to trigger the kind of emergency response that a single disaster would have, just dry enough, just persistent enough, to draw the grass down and keep it there. The traditional grazing pattern in the valley had everyone's cattle on the same sections in roughly the same rotation their fathers had used. When the grass was adequate, the waste in the system didn't matter enough to fix. When the grass was thin, it became a crisis. By May, Maris could see what was coming 3 months ahead, a collision between too many cattle on too little grass, in a valley where pride and tradition were going to make the obvious solution very hard to suggest. The obvious solution was a coordinated rotation across property lines, treating the valley's grazing land as a single managed system instead of a collection of separate fiefdoms. It would require ranchers who barely tolerated each other to make decisions together, move their cattle on a shared schedule, and occasionally graze on each other's land under agreed terms. She brought it to Gideon first, walking him through the map she'd drawn and the grazing schedule she'd built around it. He listened without interrupting, which he was good at. "Who goes first on this?" he said, when she finished. "We do. We restructure our own rotation as the demonstration. If it works, and it should work, the numbers are sound, the others can see it. And if Maddock decides this is another one of your schemes to tell people what to do with their land, then he can watch his grass die on his own terms. She folded the map. I'm not going to argue with Doyle Maddock. If he wants to participate, I'll explain the system clearly and work with him. If he doesn't, I'll work with whoever does. Gideon looked at her for a moment with that measuring look she'd gotten used to, the one that was sizing up not whether she was right, but whether she was committed to it. All right, he said. We'll do ours first. The Cowboys took the new rotation with varying degrees of grace. Rafe made a comment, the first week, about moving cattle on a woman's schedule, and Decker told him to keep his mouth closed and do the work. And that was the end of that conversation publicly, though Maris was aware it continued privately among the younger hands. She didn't try to address it directly. The rotation worked. That was the address. By late June, the grass on the sections they'd rested was visibly recovering while neighboring operations were watching their pastures thin. Tom Greer rode over to look at the Hales South Quarter one afternoon and stayed for 2 hours, asking Cantu questions and walking the fence lines and looking at the grass with the focused attention of a man recalculating something. He came to the house before he left. I want to see the schedule, he told Maris. I'll write you a copy. And I want to understand the thinking behind it, not just the schedule. She sat him down at the kitchen table and explained it from the ground up. He was a good listener. He pushed back twice on points where he thought his land's particular characteristics required a different approach, and both times he was right, and she adjusted. By the end, they had a modified version of the system that accounted for the differences between the two properties. Agnes will want to talk to you about the east section, Greer said, folding the papers she'd given him. Tell her to come when it's convenient. He stood up, and for a moment he looked like he was going to say something else, something that required a little more effort than the practical conversation they'd been having. He picked up his hat. My daughter, he said. She's 17, smart, good with figures. He paused. Agnes says she should go to school somewhere. I keep saying there's nothing wrong with what she can learn here. He stopped again. Seeing you work, I think Agnes might be right. He walked out before she could respond to that, which was probably intentional. Maris sat at the table for a while, not moving. Outside, the June afternoon had the particular dry heat of a drought year, the sky a pale, bleached blue, the grass in the yard already the wrong shade of yellow for the season. She pulled out her ledger and went back to work. There was more coming. She could feel it in the numbers, in the patterns, in the way the summer heat was sitting on the valley without relief. She didn't know exactly what shape it would take yet, but she was going to know it well before it arrived. The fire started on a Thursday. Maris knew it before she smelled it, knew it the way she had come to know most things in this valley, through accumulated observation rather than instinct, though by now the line between those two had blurred considerably. She had been watching the conditions build for 3 weeks, the drought grinding into its 4th month, the grass on the unmanaged sections gone from yellow to the particular pale brittleness that meant it would carry flame the way dry paper did, and the wind shifting in the afternoons to come out of the southwest, hot and steady and wrong for the season. She had mentioned it to Gideon in late July. She had written it in her ledger. She had even said something to Decker about keeping the burn pile cold until the weather broke. None of that mattered at 4 a.m. on a Thursday in August when Cantu pounded on the back door and she came down in her boots and coat to find him standing in the yard with his face lit orange from the direction of the hills. North Ridge, he said, moving fast. She could see it without him pointing, a line of orange against the dark that was already wider than it should have been if it had just started. It had been going for a while. The wind was carrying it southeast, which meant it was moving directly toward the valley floor and every ranch on it. Wake Gideon, she said. Get Rafe and the Prewitt brothers on horses. I need someone to ride to the Greers right now, not in an hour, right now, and then to Hollis and the Campbells. Tell them to start moving cattle south toward the creek bottom. The creek bottom won't burn. Cantu was already moving. She went back inside and pulled her map from the office. The grazing map she'd drawn months ago, which now served a different purpose, because she knew every fence line and water source and natural barrier in the valley from having drawn it. She stood at the kitchen table for 3 minutes, not long, tracing routes with her finger and thinking through what the fire needed to do, what she needed it not to do. Gideon came downstairs pulling his suspenders up. He took one look at her face and didn't ask questions. "The south fire break on our property," she said. "The plowed strip along the creek road. 8 feet wide. Not enough. No, I need it 30 feet wide before that fire comes down off the ridge. Can Decker get it done? With all hands and both teams, maybe. It'll take 4 hours. We have 3. She folded the map. I'm going to Maddox. Gideon went still. Maris. His north pasture is the first thing that burns if the fire break doesn't hold. He has 12 hands and equipment we don't. I need him. He's not going to. I know. She picked up her coat. I'm going anyway. The ride to Maddox took 20 minutes at a hard pace. The orange on the hills was brighter now, and she could smell it. That particular smell of grass fire, sharp and dry and massive. Twice she passed cattle that had broken fence in panic, running loose in the dark road, and she had to push around them and keep moving. Maddox Ranch House had lights in the windows when she arrived. Someone had already seen the fire. She tied her horse at the rail and was halfway to the door when it opened, and Maddox himself came out onto the porch in his boots and a shirt not yet fully buttoned, looking past her at the hills. How far down has it come? He said, without greeting. It's on the upper ridge now. Wind's pushing it southeast. It'll reach the valley floor in 3 hours, maybe less if the wind picks up. He looked at her then, really looked at her, with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the studied condescension of the church reception, not the careful dismissal of the conversation through the wall. Something stripped of all that. What do you need? He said. She told him. She was specific and fast, and she didn't editorialize. He listened without interrupting, which was also new. My north pasture has 300 head on it, he said, when she finished. I know. Start them south immediately. Push them toward the Greer property line. Tom Greer is already moving his cattle to the creek bottom. There's room. She paused. Your fire break equipment. Can you spare it? I'll send it with 4 men. Send 6. He looked at her for a moment. 6, he said, and turned to call for his foreman. The next 6 hours were the worst of Maris's life, and she had lived through some genuinely bad stretches. The firebreak held on the Hale property, but only barely. Decker and the hands got it to 22 feet before the fire reached the valley floor, 8 feet short of what she'd wanted, and for 40 minutes while the fire burned along the creek road, it was not clear which side of the line the wind was going to choose. She stood at the edge of it with Gideon beside her and watched the wall of flame work along the break, looking for a place to cross. And she did not breathe properly for most of those 40 minutes. It didn't cross. By mid-morning, with Maddox equipment having extended the break east to connect with the Greer property's natural barrier along the creek, the fire's southern edge was contained. The north and west flanks were still running, chewing through the dry grass on the upper ridge, but there was nothing below them that would feed it anymore. 3 outbuildings on the Hollis property burned. The Campbells lost their hay barn and 3 months of stored feed. A stretch of fence on the Hale East section went, taking 2 days to replace. Nobody lost their house. Nobody lost their life, though Rafe took a burn on his forearm that needed wrapping, and one of Maddox's hands had smoke damage to his lungs that would trouble him for weeks. The cattle were the real problem. 300 head of Maddox cattle in the Greer Creek bottom. 200 Greer cattle pushed into sections they weren't supposed to be in. Hollis's herd scattered across 4 properties in the chaos of the night drive, individual animals everywhere, fences broken. Nobody sure what belonged to whom until it could all be sorted. Maris sat down in the Greer barn on the morning after the fire with Tom Greer and Doyle Maddox and Ray Hollis and worked out a cattle accounting system on the back of a feed invoice because it was the only paper she had. She was running on no sleep and too much coffee, and her voice was rougher than usual from the smoke she'd been breathing all night. We need a central holding area, she said, somewhere neutral. We move all unattributed cattle there while we sort ownership. That way nobody's accidentally working somebody else's herd. My south pasture, Greer said. It's already got the mixed stock. Good. I need 1 man from each operation who knows their brand well and can identify stock quickly. They work the sorting together. Any disputes go to a 3-person panel. one from each of the other operations not party to the dispute. Hollis made a sound that wasn't quite agreement. That's going to take days. 4 days if we do it organized, 2 weeks if we don't. She looked at him directly. Your herd is the most scattered, Ray. This system helps you most. He looked away. Fine. Maddock had been quiet through most of this, which was unusual enough to be notable. He was a man who filled rooms with his presence and his opinions, and his silence had a different texture than other people's silence. The feed situation, he said. Yes. She had been waiting for this. The Campbells are in the worst position. They lost their entire hay reserve. At current prices and current availability, they can't replace it before the cattle start suffering. How short are they? I'll know exactly when I've talked to Margaret Campbell. My estimate is 40 to 60 tons short of what they need to carry their herd through October. Maddock turned his coffee cup on the barn floor. I can spare 20 tons. The barn went quiet. Tom Greer looked at Maddock. Hollis looked at Maddock. At what price? Greer asked. Cost. Maddock said it flatly. I'm not selling hay to a neighbor at market prices after a fire. Another silence, different in quality from the first. I can contribute 10 tons, Greer said. I've got 8 I was going to sell, Hollis said slowly. I'll hold it back. Maris wrote the numbers down. 38 tons. Not enough, but closer. I'll find the remaining shortfall, she said. There's a supplier out of Laramie I've dealt with before who may have reserve stock. You know a feed supplier in Laramie? Maddock said. I know several. She capped her pen. I'll send a wire this afternoon. Neat. The cattle thieves came 12 days after the fire, which was either opportunistic timing or planned around it. Maris was never fully certain which. What she knew was that the valley was exhausted, its fences broken in multiple places, its cattle still partially unsorted, its men running short on sleep and shorter on patience, and that in that condition a well-organized theft could take 200 head before anyone noticed what was happening. They took 160 from 3 different operations in a single night, cutting through the temporary fence repairs and pushing the cattle north through the gap in the ridge that the fire had cleared of brush. By the time Cantu found the tracks in the early morning, the herd was already 12 hours gone. Maris looked at the tracks and looked at the ridge gap and thought for approximately 30 seconds. Then she went to find Gideon. They went north through the Sentinel Gap, she said. That's 40 miles of open country up there. 40 miles to the rail junction at Prentice. If they push hard, they can make it in 3 days and load before anyone up there knows to look. She paused. We need to wire the Prentice station agent before they get there. We don't know for certain they're going to Prentice. It's the only place within range that can process that many cattle without attracting attention. There's no other buyer. She looked at the tracks again. And I've seen this pattern before. Not here, in Abilene. A band that works fires, moves in the aftermath, uses the confusion for cover. They sold at Prentice that time too. Gideon looked at her. You recognize this? I recognize the timing. I wasn't sure until I saw how they cut the fence. Quick, specific, they knew exactly which sections were weakest from the fire damage. She turned back toward the horses. Wire the Prentice agent. I'll write the description. And we need a rider to go to the county sheriff's office in Caldwell today, not tomorrow. The sheriff's office was more complicated than the telegraph. The county sheriff was a man named Brodigan, who had the quality of some elected officials of being good at appearing capable without necessarily being so. He rode out the following day with 2 deputies, looked at the tracks, asked several questions that demonstrated he hadn't read Maris's written description carefully, and suggested that cattle theft in the open territory was difficult to prosecute. With the tracks, the timing, and the Prentice connection, it's not difficult, Maris said. She was standing in Gideon's yard talking to Brodigan on his horse, which she hadn't asked him to dismount from, which meant this was going to be a short conversation on his terms. If the station agent wires back confirmation that a large herd arrived in the next 48 hours, you have a strong case. A wire confirmation isn't evidence of theft. No, but combined with the tracks, the fence cuts, the timeline, and signed statements from 3 property owners, it's more than enough to make an arrest and let the circuit court sort the rest. Brodigan looked down at her from his horse. He had a particular look that men in positions of official authority sometimes wore when speaking to a woman who was telling them how to do their job. Not quite dismissive, not quite hostile, but not far from either. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "The station agent's name is Elford Cross," she said. "I have his wire address. The 3 property owners whose cattle were taken have already signed statements. I have those too." She held up a folder. "I can give you all of it right now, or you can come down and get it when you're ready to pursue this properly." A long pause. His horse shifted under him. "I'll take what you have," he said. She handed him the folder. He went to Prentice. The herd arrived there 30 hours later. They'd pushed the cattle hard, and Cross had been ready. Brodigan, to his credit, had ridden through the night and been there when they arrived. 4 men were arrested at the rail junction, with 143 head of identifiable cattle. The other 17 were never recovered. Maris wrote that number down in her ledger and left it there. Some losses stayed losses. Adding them up honestly was the only honest thing to do. The meeting at the Maddock Ranch happened on a Saturday in early September, 3 weeks after the fire, called by Maddock himself, which surprised people. He'd sent riders to every operation in the valley with a request that was closer to a summons: ranchers, foremen, anyone who ran cattle on Sweetwater Valley Range. Maris went with Gideon, arriving to find 23 people packed into Maddock's main room, more ranchers than she'd ever seen in one place outside of a town meeting. Maddock stood at the front of the room. He was not a man who gave speeches, and it showed. He started and stopped twice before he found the line he was looking for. "Most of you know what happened the last 3 weeks," he said. "Some of you lost buildings. Some of you lost cattle. All of us got through it, which is not nothing." He paused. "The reason we got through it is that somebody had a plan when the rest of us didn't." The room was very quiet. "I've been running cattle in this valley for 20 years, and I'll tell you plainly that I did not see the Voss water business coming, and I would not have thought to propose what Maris Hale proposed with the grazing rotation. And during the fire, I stood on my porch in the dark, not knowing what to do until she rode up and told me." He stopped. "That's hard to say. I'm saying it anyway." He looked around the room. "What I'm suggesting is that we formalize what's already been happening. The cross-property coordination, the shared information, the kind of thinking that looks at the whole valley instead of just one person's fence lines." He looked at Maris directly for the first time. "I'm suggesting she leads it." The room was the particular kind of quiet where people are deciding how they feel about something. Hollis, from the back, said, "What does that look like, practically?" Maris answered before Maddock could because she'd been thinking about this since the morning after the fire, and she had a clearer picture of it than he did. Monthly meetings, rotating locations, shared early warning for weather, water issues, any unusual activity near property lines. A common fund for emergency response. Small contributions from each operation held in reserve. And a communication system, riders and wire, that can move information across the valley in hours instead of days. "Who decides how the fund gets used?" Campbell asked. "A 3-person committee, elected from the group." "Not me. I'll advise, not decide. That's important." She looked around the room. "This only works if everyone trusts the structure. A structure where one person decides everything doesn't hold." "Seems like one person deciding everything is what got us through the fire," someone said from near the door. She couldn't see who. "Getting through a crisis and building something that lasts are different problems," she said. "I'm more interested in the second one." The vote, when Maddock called it, wasn't unanimous. 3 ranchers abstained and 1 voted against outright, a man named Gerber, who didn't trust collective anything and said so. But the rest, 19 out of 23, voted yes. Gideon was quiet on the ride home, which was sometimes how he processed things. "You all right?" she asked after a while. "Just thinking." "About?" He looked ahead at the road. "About how different this is from what I expected when I asked you to look at the books 2 years ago." "Different how?" "Larger." He was quiet a moment. "I knew you were good. I didn't know the scale of it." She wasn't sure how to respond to that. She looked at the road too, at the valley spread out around them in the September evening, the grass thin from the drought, but still there, still holding, the smoke smell fading now from the ridge where the fire had run. "I didn't either," she said, which was the honest answer. The valley was different now from what it had been in August. Not because the problems were gone, the drought was still there. The Voss water claim was still working through the legal process. The rebuilt fences were still green lumber and would need maintenance all winter. The problems were real, and most of them were still ongoing. But the valley was connected now in a way it hadn't been, wired together by the specific catastrophe of the fire and the weeks of work that had come after it, and Maris understood, riding home in the September evening with the smell of smoke still faint in the air, that connection was not nothing. It was, in fact, the most important thing. The Sweetwater Valley Stockmen's Association held its first official meeting in October in the back room of Harlan's feed store, which was the largest indoor space available that wasn't a saloon or a church. Maris had written the bylaws herself over the course of 2 weeks, drafting and revising at the kitchen table, while Gideon read over her shoulder and occasionally said things like, "That section's going to cause an argument," or "Hollis won't sign off on that word." And she would look at the language again and usually conclude he was right and change it. The bylaws were 4 pages. She had wanted 3, but some things couldn't be made shorter without becoming vague, and vague bylaws were an invitation to the kind of disputes that destroyed organizations before they got started. She knew this from watching Cutter Reese's operation in Abilene handle 3 separate internal collapses over contract language that nobody had bothered to make precise. 19 ranchers signed. Gerber did not, which she had expected. 2 others held back, wanting to see how the first season went before committing, which was reasonable, and she said so when Gideon expressed frustration about it on the ride home. "If it works, they'll sign in spring," she said. "If it doesn't work, they were right not to." "It'll work. Probably, but I'd rather earn the confidence than assume it." The first real test of the association came not from weather or theft, but from Calder Voss, who had apparently decided that the legal challenge to his water filings was serious enough to require a direct response. His response arrived in the form of a letter delivered to Gideon in November, written by a Cheyenne attorney named Prescott, informing them that Mr. Voss was prepared to negotiate a settlement that would formalize certain water access arrangements in exchange for the withdrawal of the pending challenge. Maris read the letter 3 times. Then she set it down. "He's scared," she said. Gideon looked up from across the table. "That's a settlement offer. Settlement offers from men like Voss don't usually mean scared. This one does. Read the 3rd paragraph again." She pushed the letter toward him. "He's offering to formalize access, not to relinquish the filings. That means he still wants to hold the paper, but he can't afford for the challenge to go to a judge. Something in the filing history won't survive examination." Gideon read the 3rd paragraph. "You think there's a defect in his claims? I think there's more than one. I've been through the secondary survey records from 1873, and there are 2 filings that reference a property boundary marker that was moved in 1875. If those filings are anchored to a marker that no longer legally defines the boundary, they don't describe what he thinks they describe." "Did you tell the attorney about this?" "Not yet. I wanted to read the settlement offer first." She picked the letter back up. "We're not settling. Maris, the legal costs will be less than what we lose if Voss holds those filings through a dry decade." She looked at him steadily. "We've come too far in this to take a bad deal because it's offered politely." He held her look for a moment. "All right," he said. "We don't settle." She wrote to their attorney in Cheyenne, a woman named Cordelia Fitch, who had been recommended by Tom Greer's brother-in-law and who had turned out to be the sharpest legal mind Maris had encountered outside of a courthouse, and laid out the boundary marker issue in full. Cordelia's reply came back in 10 days, 2 pages of close legal reasoning that confirmed Maris's reading and added 2 additional defects she hadn't found, one of which was significant enough that Cordelia thought it might invalidate 3 of the filings outright. The case went to the district court in February. Maris attended every session, sitting in the gallery with a notepad and writing down everything she needed to follow up on. Gideon came to the first session and the last, which was the right division of their time. The ranch still had to run, and one of them needed to be there. The judge was a spare, deliberate man named Calloway, who had the quality of listening to all of it before forming a visible opinion. He asked questions that suggested he understood the technical water rights issues better than Maris had dared hope. The Voss attorney, Prescott, who had written the settlement letter and who was good but not exceptional, tried twice to steer the argument toward a question of competing economic interests rather than the specific legal defects in the filings, and both times Cordelia Fitch brought it back to the boundary marker and the survey records with the patient precision of someone who had been in this exact argument before. The ruling came in March, and it was not everything Maris had hoped for. 3 of the 5 contested filings were invalidated outright. The other 2 were sent back for resurvey, which meant they remained in limbo for another 18 months, but could not be acted upon in the meantime. Voss retained a reduced water claim on the upper drainage, smaller than what he'd built, but not nothing. Cordelia wrote to say the outcome was as good as she'd realistically expected. Maris sat with that for a day and then agreed. She'd wanted all 5. She got 3 in a holding pattern on the other 2, and the valley's primary water access was clear. It was enough to build on. She wrote the results up in plain language and presented them at the March Association meeting, and the room received it with the particular relief of people who had been holding their breath for months without letting themselves admit it. Afterward, in the yard outside the feed store, Doyle Maddock walked over to her. He stood for a moment without saying anything, which was characteristic of him when he was working toward something difficult. "That attorney you found," he said. "Fitch." "Yes. I may need someone like her for a matter on my east boundary, old easement dispute that's been sitting unresolved since my father's time." Maris pulled her coat tighter against the March wind. "I can give you her address." "I'd appreciate it." He paused. "You should also know, I've been talking to some of the ranchers up in the next county about the association. They've been watching what happened with the fire response and the Voss matter." "Interested?" 3 of them, maybe 4. They'd want to send someone to a meeting before committing. She looked at him. In the year and a half since the wedding, Doyle Maddock had never once referred to the church reception or the comment he'd made, or the wall he'd put between himself and the Hale operation. She had not expected him to. What she had expected, and what had happened, was that events had moved faster than his resistance and left him with a simple choice: adapt or be left behind by the thing he'd been too proud to join. He had adapted. It hadn't been graceful, but he'd done it. "Tell them the next meeting is the first Saturday in April," she said. "They're welcome." Spring came and the drought broke. Not dramatically. There was no single storm that ended it, but through a sequence of rains in March and April that landed when the ground could still use them, filling the springs and the creek and bringing the grass back in the sections that the rotational system had kept from being grazed into nothing. The recovery was faster than it would have been without the rotation. Maris tracked it in her ledger, comparing the grass condition month by month against her notes from the previous 2 years, and the numbers were better than she'd let herself expect. The ranch itself had its best year since before the drought started. Not a great year. There were still debt obligations from the legal costs and the fire repairs, and 2 of the summer months were harder than projected, but a year that moved in the right direction on every metric that mattered. She could see, for the first time since she'd sat down with Gideon's books at the kitchen table 3 years ago, a trajectory that wasn't just survival. Rafe quit in May. He'd been offered work at a larger outfit near the territorial capital, better wages, and he came to tell Gideon about it with the manner of a man expecting an argument. Gideon shook his hand and said to ride well. After Rafe left, Gideon mentioned it to Maris in passing, and she said only that they'd replace him with someone who didn't need to prove things, and they did. A quiet, competent hand named Briggs, who had worked with Cantu years before, and who, within 2 weeks, had settled into the operation as though he'd always been there. The association grew through the summer. By July, it had 24 member operations, including 3 from the adjacent county that Maddock had mentioned, and the monthly meetings had developed a rhythm that was becoming self-sustaining. Ranchers bringing problems to the group working through them collectively, the early warning system flagging 2 potential trouble spots before they became crises. Maris ran the meetings with the same direct, agenda-focused approach she brought to everything, but she had been deliberate since the beginning about distributing actual authority. The 3-person committee, Cantu and Tom Greer and Agnes Greer's daughter Clara, who was 18 now and had been attending meetings for 6 months with a sharpness that reminded Maris of herself at that age, handled the emergency fund. Hollis ran the communication network, which had turned out to suit his close-mouthed, organized nature better than any other role available. She had learned this from watching Reese's operation fail. Organizations that concentrated everything in one person collapsed when that person was unavailable, wrong, or simply tired. The goal was to build something that could run without her at the center of every decision, which paradoxically required her to be extremely present in the early stages, shaping the structure and the habits before stepping back. The stepping back was harder than she'd expected, which she hadn't anticipated. She'd thought she would find it straightforward, even welcome. She had never been someone who needed to be the center of a room. But there was a difference between not needing to be central and actively removing yourself from decisions you could see going slightly wrong, and that difference required a kind of patience she had to consciously practice. Gideon noticed. She knew he noticed because he said nothing about it, which was his way. One evening in August, he came in from the range and found her at the office desk staring at a letter from Hollis about a communication network dispute that she had already decided not to involve herself in, and was finding it difficult not to involve herself in. "Hard day?" he said. "Medium day." She set the letter down. "Hollis is handling something wrong. Will it resolve itself?" "Eventually. Not as efficiently as if I—" She stopped. But it has to be his call. If I fix everything he mishandles, he never learns to handle it, and I'm the only one who can run the communication network, which is exactly the problem I was trying to prevent. Gideon leaned in the doorway. "How long do you think it'll take him to sort it?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. "And if you stepped in?" 3 days. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of patience." "Yes." "You going to manage it?" She looked at the letter. "I'm going to try." He went to start supper without another word, which was the right response. She sat at the desk a while longer, then put the letter in the Hollis file and went to help with supper. All right. The Voss matter resolved itself fully in November, 16 months after the district court ruling. The 2 filings under resurvey came back with results that confirmed Cordelia Fitch's analysis of the boundary marker issue, and both were struck from the record. Voss made no further legal moves, and by the following spring his name had largely stopped appearing in the Valley's conversations, not because anyone had forgotten what he'd attempted, but because the attempt had failed completely enough that there was nothing left to be concerned about. Maris received Cordelia's final letter on the matter on a Tuesday morning and read it at the kitchen table with her coffee. Then she opened her ledger to the page where she had first written Calder Voss's name 18 months ago, next to the notation about the water diversion in the Northeast Spring, and she drew a single clean line through it. She was still sitting there when Gideon came in from the morning check. "The Voss filings are gone," she said. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. Something moved across his face that wasn't easy to name. Not surprise because he'd been tracking the case as closely as she had, but something that had been held in suspension for a long time and was now releasing. "All of them?" "All of them. The resurvey confirmed the boundary issue. Both remaining filings struck from record." He came to the table and sat down heavily in the chair across from her. He looked at the ledger with the line drawn through Voss's name. "It's over," he said. "The Voss part is over. You say that like there's another part starting. There's always another part." She closed the ledger. "But this one's a good stopping point." He looked at her for a long time in the quiet kitchen, with the November light coming through the east window at the angle that meant it was still early in the morning, and the day hadn't fully committed to itself yet. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right. When I asked you to come look at the books 3 years ago, I knew you were capable. I thought I understood the scale of it." He stopped, as if the right words weren't in the first place he was looking. "I didn't. I want you to know that I understand the scale of it now, and that I've been grateful every day for what you've built here, and that I'm sorry it took the rest of them longer to see it." Maris was quiet for a moment. Outside, the first real cold of November was settling into the yard, the grass gone gray with it, the sky the low white of weather coming. "You saw it," she said. "That was enough to start." "It wasn't—" "Gideon." She looked at him directly. "It was enough." He nodded, slowly, and something in him settled. She got up and refilled her coffee and stood at the window looking at the yard, at the rebuilt fence line and the repaired barn roof, and the well casing that Cantu had replaced 3 seasons ago and which had not given them a single problem since. All of it imperfect. All of it held together by work and attention and the particular kind of stubbornness that wasn't the same as pride, the kind that came from knowing what something was worth and refusing to let it be worth less. The association meeting was in 2 weeks. Clara Greer had proposed a new water monitoring protocol that was better than the one Maris had designed, and Maris had been genuinely pleased about that in a way that she hadn't expected to feel so cleanly. Hollis had sorted his communication network dispute. It had taken him 5 weeks, not 3, and the resolution he'd reached was different from what she would have done and probably more durable because the people involved had worked it out themselves. Things were being built. Imperfectly, slowly, but built. She turned from the window. "I need to ride out and check the northeast spring this morning," she said. "The flow rate's due." Gideon stood up from the table. "I'll come." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He picked up his hat. "I want to." She almost smiled. 3 years into this, and he still said it the same way he'd said it the first time, on the first morning, when she'd told him she was going to ride the property line, and he'd said the same words in the same tone, and she hadn't yet understood what they actually meant. She understood them now. She picked up her coat and her ledger and went out into the November morning, and he came with her, and the valley spread around them in the cold, pale light. All its ranches and fences and water lines and the people who worked them, all of it connected now in ways it hadn't been, threaded together by what one dry autumn and a fire and a long season of hard work had made possible. It was not what she had planned when she'd packed her trunks in Abilene and come west. She had planned something smaller and more contained, something that fit within the borders of one operation and one set of books. She had not planned on a valley, but here it was, and here she was, and the work was not finished. It was never finished, that was the nature of it, but it was real, and it was hers, and that was more than most people got. The northeast spring ran full that December, fuller than Maris had recorded it in 4 years of measuring. She stood at the edge of it in the cold morning with her ledger open and wrote the number down, and then she stood there a moment longer than the task required, just watching the water move. It came out of the hillside the way it always had, quiet and steady, indifferent to everything that had happened around it. The diversion, the legal fight, the fire, all the seasons of worry and work. The water didn't know about any of that. It just ran where the land told it to run, and now the land was properly accounted for, and so it ran where it was supposed to. She closed the ledger and walked back to her horse. 4 years. She had been in Sweetwater Valley 4 years, and the person who had arrived by stage with 2 trunks and a ledger full of someone else's numbers felt, on mornings like this, like a woman she knew well but hadn't spoken to in a long time. The association's year-end meeting that December drew 31 member operations, which meant the back room of the feed store was no longer adequate. Maddock had offered his barn, which was large and better heated than most alternatives, and so 31 ranchers and their foremen, and in several cases their wives, sat on bales and borrowed chairs in Doyle Maddock's barn on a Saturday afternoon in December and went through the year's accounting. The numbers were good, not uniformly good. The Prewitt brothers had lost a section of fence to a late-season flood, and it had cost them more to repair than projected, and the Campbell operation was still carrying debt from the fire 2 years prior. But the overall picture was the best the valley had produced in a decade, and the association's shared analysis showed clearly why. The rotational grazing system, now in its 3rd year across 26 of the 31 member properties, had produced measurably better grass condition than the county average. The early warning communication network had flagged 1 potential water dispute and 1 fence encroachment before either became a legal matter. The emergency fund, which had never been used for its original purpose of fire response, had instead been deployed twice for smaller crises. Once to help the Hollis operation bridge a cash shortage during a cattle sale that went sideways, and once to fund a joint legal response to a railroad easement claim that affected 4 properties on the valley's eastern edge. Maris presented the numbers herself, which she always did, because she believed that a community's financial picture should be explained by the person who understood it best, and not summarized to the point of uselessness. She stood at the front of Maddox's barn with a chalkboard she'd had brought in, and she went through it section by section, and she could see in the room the particular quality of attention that came from people who had real stakes in what they were hearing. Afterward, during the informal part of the meeting when people ate and talked, Ray Hollis found her near the door. "That railroad easement matter," he said. He was holding a plate of food he hadn't touched. "The way you structured the joint response, all 4 operations filing together. The railroad's attorney told my man they'd never seen that approach from individual ranchers before." "It's a standard approach in commercial litigation," Maris said. "It just doesn't get used at this scale very often, because the parties usually can't coordinate well enough." "Well," he looked at his plate. "It worked." "It did." He was quiet for a moment. Hollis was never a man who arrived at things quickly, but he arrived. "I voted against you," he said. "At the first meeting, when Maddock put it to a vote." "I know. I want you to know I'm aware of that." She looked at him. He was not a man given to this kind of conversation, and the effort it was costing him was visible. "Ray, the vote was 4 years ago. What matters is the work since. I'm just saying I was wrong. You were being careful. That's not the same as wrong." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been disagreement, and went back to find his foreman, and Maris watched him go and thought about how the most stubborn people, when they finally came around completely, and how that was worth something, even if it was slow. Clara Greer's water monitoring protocol had been running for 18 months by the time she turned 20, and it was better than Maris's original system by every measure that mattered. Clara had refined the flow rate tracking to account for seasonal variations that Maris's initial model had smoothed over, and she'd added a soil saturation component that gave earlier warning of drainage shifts. Maris had watched her develop it the way you watch someone find their stride, that particular moment when a capable person stops being tentative and starts being fully themselves. She rode out to the Greer place on a cold January afternoon, not for any meeting, but because Clara had sent a note asking a question about the legal standing of the monitoring data in a water dispute context, and some questions were better answered in person. Agnes Greer met her at the door and brought her inside, and they sat at the same table where Tom Greer had heard Maris's first presentation about the Voss water filings 4 years ago. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke, and the particular domestic industry of a household that was always doing 3 things at once. Clara came in from the back of the house with a folder and sat down across from Maris with the directness of someone who had learned from watching that preamble was usually wasted time. "The monitoring records," she said, opening the folder. "If a dispute goes to court, how do they get admitted?" Maris walked her through it: chain of custody, consistency of method, the importance of the recording format being standardized across all the stations in the network. Clara listened and took notes and asked questions that were better than the questions most adults asked about the same material. "You should think about studying law," Maris said at one point. Clara looked up from her notes. "I've been thinking about land management, or hydrology. Either of those would be useful here." "That's what I keep coming back to, useful here." She set her pen down. "Is that too small? Staying in the valley, I mean. My father thinks I should go to a city somewhere." Maris thought about this carefully, because it was a real question and deserved a real answer. "What do you think?" "I think the valley needs people who understand it deeply. I think most of the people who go to cities to get smart come back and apply what they learned wrong because they don't understand the specific ground they're working with anymore." She paused. "But I also think I might be telling myself that because it's easier to stay than to go." "Probably both things are true at once," Maris said. "How do you tell which one to listen to?" "You figure out what you actually want to build, not what you want to achieve. What you want to build with your hands over time. And then you go where that building is possible." She looked at Clara steadily. "For me, it was here. I didn't plan it that way, but this is where the problem was that I could actually solve." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at her notes. "Can I ask you something else?" she said. "Go ahead. When you came here, before the association, before any of it, did people make it hard for you because of—" She stopped, not quite finishing the sentence. Maris knew what the sentence contained. "Yes." "How did you handle it?" "Badly, some of the time. I got angry and didn't show it, which is its own kind of problem. It sits in you and curdles if you're not careful. And I spent too much energy in the first year trying to make people comfortable with me, which was wasted effort. The ones who were going to come around came around when the work proved itself. The ones who weren't going to come around didn't, mostly, and I had to accept that some rooms were going to be uncomfortable and do the work anyway. Clara wrote something down. Maris wasn't sure what. The thing I wish someone had told me earlier, Maris said, is that you don't need the room to be comfortable. You need the room to be workable. Those are different. Agnes Greer, who had been quiet at the stove during this whole conversation, said without turning around, "I'm writing that down too." The spring brought two things Maris had not anticipated. The first was a letter from a land management board in Cheyenne asking whether the Sweetwater Valley Stockmen's Association would be willing to present its rotational grazing methodology and water coordination system at a territorial conference in April. The letter was addressed to the association generally, but it had been directed to Maris specifically by the county clerk who'd received it, and she understood why. She had filed more documents with the county in 4 years than most operations filed in 20, and her name was on most of them. She brought it to the association's March meeting and presented it neutrally, letting the group decide. Maddox said immediately that she should go and present it. Hollis, more carefully, said the association should be represented, but that the decision of who went should be hers. Tom Greer said the methodology was Maris's work, and she should speak to it directly. Clara said nothing but caught Maris's eye and gave her a look that communicated, without words, that she already knew what the answer should be. "I'll go," Maris said. "If someone comes with me. I want this represented as a community effort, not one person's project." Maddox went with her. This was not what she had expected, but when she thought about it, it made sense. Maddox carried a kind of authority that came from decades of recognized standing in the territory, and whatever resistance a conference room full of experienced ranchers might have to a woman presenting a grazing methodology. Doyle Maddox sitting next to her and confirming the results from his own land was a counter-argument they couldn't easily dismiss. The conference was 2 days in Cheyenne, in a large meeting room that smelled of old wood and tobacco and the particular formality of men who had traveled a distance to be official about something. There were 14 presentations. Maris's was the last of the first day. She had prepared thoroughly, which was her nature, but she had also prepared for the specific resistance she expected, which was different from general preparation. She knew what questions a skeptical audience asked. She had been answering skeptical questions for 4 years, and she had data for all of them, clean and specific and documented. The presentation ran long, not because she had too much material, but because the questions started before she'd finished and kept coming. A rancher from the Northern Territory asked about the rotation schedule in a drought year with challenged grass coverage. A water board representative asked about the legal framework for the cross-property coordination. A younger man near the back asked about the emergency fund structure and how disputes within it were adjudicated. She answered all of it. Maddox interjected twice, both times with specific numbers from his own operation that corroborated what she'd presented. The second time, she saw the rancher from the Northern Territory nod slowly, the particular nod of a man recalculating his position. Afterward, in the corridor, 3 men came to speak to her separately. One asked for a copy of the bylaw documents. One wanted to know Cordelia Fitch's contact information for a water rights matter. One simply stood there for a moment and said his valley had been struggling with the same kind of isolated operation problem for 6 years, and he hadn't been able to see the solution until today. Maris gave him the same answer she had given everyone who asked her where to start. Start with the records. Start with what the land is actually doing rather than what you expect it to do, and start by finding 2 other people who are willing to look at the problem together instead of alone. "That's simpler than I expected," he said. "Most things are, once you've done the work to see them clearly." On the train back to Harlan, Maddox sat across from her and looked out the window for a long time. The territorial landscape moved past in the early spring light. The same brown and gray palette of the frontier everywhere, the same dry distances. "I owe you an apology," he said, without looking away from the window. "Doyle, I'm not a man who does this often, so let me get through it." He turned from the window. He was older looking than when she'd first met him, though it had only been 4 years. Or maybe she was just seeing him more clearly. What I said to Gideon the first year, about how things should be run. I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong before I finished saying it, and I said it anyway because I was too proud to admit that someone I'd underestimated understood something I didn't. Maris was quiet for a moment. The train moved through a long curve and the afternoon light came through the window at an angle that made everything look briefly golden and then went back to ordinary. "You came and helped during the fire," she said. "You sent 6 men." "That's not the same as an apology." "No, but it's what mattered." She looked at him. "Doyle, I didn't come to Sweetwater Valley to make people apologize to me. I came to do work that needed doing. The apology doesn't change the work." He held her look for a moment. "I know that. I'm saying it for myself, not for you." She accepted that. It was, she thought, probably the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. But Gideon was in the yard when she got back, repairing the gate hinge that had been giving trouble since February. He looked up when she rode in, and something in his expression when he saw her, a specific kind of settling, the way a person's whole body changes when something they were holding in suspension gets released, told her that he had been more aware of the trip's stakes than he'd let on. "How was it?" he said. "Good." She dismounted and handed her horse off to Briggs. "Better than I expected." He set down the hinge and the mallet. "Tell me." She told him over supper, going through it the way she went through everything with him, directly, with the parts that had worked and the parts that hadn't, without performing more confidence than she'd actually felt. He listened the way he always listened, fully, asking questions that showed he'd followed what she'd said. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're going to have to do this more," he said. "Present it. Other places." "Probably." "That going to be a problem?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "But I want the association solid enough that it runs without me being here for 2 days at a time. It's close. Another season and it'll be there. Clara can run a meeting already." "I know." Maris looked at her plate. "That's what I was building toward." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Briefly, the way he did sometimes. Not a romantic gesture exactly, just contact, just the acknowledgement of proximity and shared history. She turned her hand and they sat like that for a moment in the kitchen that had been the site of so many late evenings with documents spread across it, all those problems she'd worked through in this room. "I want to tell you something," she said, which was not the way she usually started sentences. "All right. When I came here, I was not in a good state. Not obviously broken. I wasn't going to show that. But I was tired in a way that was getting close to something worse than tired. Abilene had taken a lot out of me, and I hadn't admitted how much." She looked at the table. "I came because Nessa asked me to, and because I had nowhere better to go. I didn't come with a plan to build anything. I came because I needed to be somewhere that wasn't where I'd been." He was very still across the table. "What I'm saying is that the Valley gave me something I didn't know I needed, and you gave me something I didn't know I needed. And I don't always say that kind of thing because it's hard to say without it sounding like something it's not, but I wanted to say it." Gideon was quiet for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the April night was full of the particular sounds of a working ranch settling into itself. The horses in the barn, the wind in the new grass, the creak of the repaired gate that was finally hanging right. "I knew you were tired," he said. "I didn't know how far it went." "No, I didn't let you." "You let me now." "A little." She almost smiled. "Don't push it." He did smile, and it changed his face the way it always did, taking 10 years off it. "I wouldn't dare." There's a thing that happens sometimes in places where people have worked hard together through hard seasons, where the difficulty leaves something behind that the good times don't. Not trauma exactly, not the kind that hollows out and leaves damage, but a particular density of shared experience that makes ordinary days feel more solid than they might have otherwise. The kind of thing where a person can stand in a yard on a spring morning and look at a fence line or a water trough or a section of rebuilt gate and know the full history of it, the problem it solved and the problem before that, and the season it took to get here, and feel that knowledge as something real in the body rather than just in the mind. Maris understood this by the time the Sweetwater Valley Stockmen's Association held its 5th annual meeting in the spring of the year that the territorial legislature adopted a water rights coordination framework that drew directly on the legal structure she and Cordelia Fitch had built for the original Voss challenge. She hadn't lobbied for it, hadn't known it was happening until Cordelia sent a letter. But the work had moved outward on its own, the way water moves when you clear what's blocking it. She was 36 years old. She was not tired in the bad way anymore. The Northeast Spring still ran full. She measured it every 2 weeks, the same way she always had, because consistency of observation was what made the data useful, and she saw no reason to stop now that the crisis was over. Clara had offered to take over the measurement on her behalf, and Maris had said she would let her know, which was her way of saying not yet, because there was something in that particular task, the riding out alone in the early morning, the cold water, the number written in the ledger, that she wanted to keep for herself a while longer. What she knew, after 4 years and 1 drought and 1 fire and 1 legal fight and 31 member operations and more meetings than she could count, was something she might have been able to say before she came to Sweetwater Valley, but couldn't have meant the way she meant it now. That the land doesn't care about your plans. It has its own logic, its water tables, and its grass cycles, and its weather patterns that shift over decades in ways that make the habits of one generation wrong for the next. Most people fight that. They run the rotation their fathers ran and graze the sections their grandfathers grazed and call it tradition. And the land slowly stops cooperating, and they blame the weather or the markets or the bank, and sometimes those things are genuinely to blame, but often the land is just doing what land does when you stop paying attention to it. You had to watch. You had to write it down and look at what the numbers actually showed rather than what you wanted them to show. And you had to be willing to change what you were doing when the evidence said the change was necessary, even when the change was inconvenient or embarrassing or cost you something you'd been counting on. And you could not do any of that alone. Not really, not for long. You could see further than other people and work harder than other people and be right more often than other people. And none of it would matter enough if you were the only one carrying it, because one person's knowledge and one person's attention and one person's stubbornness was not equal to what a valley needed over time. You needed other people to see what you were seeing, to learn what you'd learned, to carry it forward when you weren't there. And that meant you had to teach it, even when teaching was slower than doing, even when watching someone else make a mistake that you could have prevented was genuinely painful. That was the thing she hadn't understood before she came here, not the land management or the water rights or the legal structure. She'd figured those out, the part about needing to give it away, about how the measure of whether something would last was not how well she understood it, but how well she'd built the conditions for other people to understand it too. She understood it now. The spring meeting ended at 4 in the afternoon, and people drifted out into the late spring light in groups of 2 and 3, talking the way people talk when they have things to figure out together. Maris stood near the door and watched them go. Maddock walked out with Tom Greer, the two of them in conversation about something, their heads bent together over a piece of paper Maddock was holding. Clara walked out with Hollis's youngest son, who had been attending meetings for the past year and who had, quietly, become the kind of person who showed up before a meeting to help set up chairs. Agnes Greer stopped on her way out and put a hand briefly on Maris's arm, the specific touch of a woman communicating something that doesn't need words, and then kept walking. Gideon was the last out. He stopped beside her in the doorway, looking at the yard full of people. "Same time next month?" he said. "Same time next month." He looked at her for a moment. That same measuring look, 4 years on, still the same, but carrying now everything those 4 years had put in it. "Good meeting," he said. "Good enough," she said. And they walked out together into the spring afternoon, into the valley that was still imperfect and still demanding and still entirely real, and the work went on.